took a while, but this week Sweden got the green light on its bid to join NATO. Following Finland's accession last year, NATO is now firmly anchored in the high north. Will that strengthen the alliance or risk provoking Finland's neighbor Russia? Meanwhile, new trouble is brewing in southeastern Europe as the breakaway Republic of Transnistria, just south of Ukraine, asks Russia for protection. As the challenges multiply, NATO members send diverging signals in the direction of Moscow, with France's president sparking pushback by refusing to rule out sending ground troops to Ukraine. Our topic this week, Sweden and Finland in NATO, a strategic defeat for Russia? Hello and welcome to The Point. It's great to have you with us. Our guests this week, Alexandra van Namen heads DW's Brussels Bureau, covers NATO and security policy, and has also reported from Russia. And it's a pleasure to welcome Daniel Hegedus. He is a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund with a focus on Central Europe. And Colonel Wolfgang Richter joins us virtually from Vienna. He's a senior advisor at the Austrian Institute for Europe and Security Policy. So let me begin, if I may, with you, Alexandra. Two formerly neutral nations join the Western Alliance. How momentous is this shift? Does it significantly strengthen NATO?
The answer is yes, definitely. Having Finland and Sweden join NATO is a big win for the alliance. When we talk about Sweden, they have a very highly capable armed forces. Their geographic situation improve NATO's posture in the Baltic Sea. And of course, in addition, we have to say that Sweden has already been integrated to some extent into NATO structures. They have been invited to meetings, they have participated in exercises, and now that they are able to join the alliance is also showing the Kremlin that only Finland wanting to be in the club was not an isolated incident. So this is a reaction to Russia's aggression against Ukraine.
Daniel, when Finland and Sweden first applied to join, some analysts said that their membership would turn the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake. Would you agree with that? And what do you see as the geopolitical implications of the expansion?
Yeah, the geopolitical implication is that NATO's northern flank is significantly strengthened, and especially the organization's ability to reinforce its positions within the Baltic countries, which traditionally used to be the most exposed forepost of the organization since they joined NATO. I think the positions are significantly strengthened, significantly reinforced, and against that background, the posture against Russia to undertake any thought experiments to challenge NATO positions in the region, the message is that it can be potentially a very bad idea.
So Baltic Sea, NATO lake?
Baltic Sea, NATO lake. So definitely in wartime, the operational capability of the Russian Baltic fleet to conduct maneuvers will be significantly limited.
Wolfgang, at the same time, we have the U.S. equivocating about further support for Ukraine, and presumed Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump casting doubt on whether the U.S. would even defend all of its fellow NATO allies. Under those circumstances, doesn't that dilute the effects of this expansion by undermining trust in the notion of collective defense as a whole?
Yes, Melinda, I think your question is quite correct. One should not forget that Sweden and Finland joined NATO. Also, they could also have embarked on or relied on the EU defense commitments which are enshrined in the EU treaty. But the big difference between the EU and NATO is the US. The US provides a nuclear umbrella, or at least nuclear guarantees, which is important for Finland and Sweden and all others, of course, since Russia is the second or one of the two big nuclear countries on the globe. And this comes as a contradiction. On the one side, they rely now on NATO with US guarantees. On the other side, the US, at least Trump, has cast doubt whether these guarantees will really be complied with. And this makes clear why NATO is now in a difficult position. In addition to the question why the US Congress cannot deliver weapons and financial means to Ukraine, which is also foreshadowing probably the elections in November in the US.
Thanks very much. And we will come back to the stability of NATO and also the nuclear issues in a moment. But first, I'd like to take a closer look at what the accession of Finland and Sweden, NATO's 31st and 32nd members, means for the alliance and the region.
They're strengthening NATO. 20,000 Swedish servicemen and women are now a part of it too. The country is giving up a long tradition for more security in the NATO alliance. Sweden is leaving 200 years of neutrality and military non-alignment behind. This is a big step. The Swedish military is considered efficient and its navy is equipped with state-of-the-art equipment. The country has also reintroduced compulsory military service and could quickly mobilize soldiers in the event of war. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine changed everything for Finland and Sweden. Both countries had already applied to join NATO in May 2022, a quick process for Finland. But in the case of Sweden, Turkey and Hungary had reservations. New arms deals for both countries were a factor in getting them to agree. Which means NATO is moving closer to Russia. After expanding east, it is now also expanding north. Finland has been a member since 2023, and now Sweden is joining as the 32nd member state. But how strong is the new NATO really?
Alexander, you mentioned briefly in your first remarks what Sweden brings to the alliance. Say a little more about that, if you would, please, how much these two countries add to NATO's defensive capability, but also where you think the challenges might lie in integrating them and really ensuring a cohesive whole.
Well, I think what was a big problem was not to have Sweden in the alliance right now, because we know that NATO is overhauling their defense plans, and Sweden has been an important country in that. So it was hurting the alliance not to have Sweden as a member, and it's going to help to implement those new defense plans, knowing that Sweden is now in the alliance. And as I mentioned, they have a highly capable armed forces, unlike some other members of NATO who joined the alliance after the end of the Cold War. And they will improve the situation in the Baltic Sea. We already talked about that. And the Baltic states can feel much safer now because Sweden can help to make sure that they can be there can be sea reinforcement. So if needed, if there is anything, if Russia would risk any miscalculation, until now the Baltic states would need to be provided with weapons and armed forces through a very vulnerable border crossing between Poland and Lithuania. And now the whole situation has changed. So I think there is no real challenge to integrate Sweden, but what is a bit problematic is the whole process, that it took so long, and that we saw that some members of the alliance were apparently not so concerned about the Russian threat.
And exactly that is what I would like to talk to Daniel about. You are from Hungary, and Hungary, in fact, was one of the NATO members that held this up for so very long. In fact, it is sometimes said that Hungary and Turkey were both doing Putin's bidding by delaying, especially the Swedish accession, for so long. What kind of signal does that send about alliance unity or disunity?
Yes, I think it sent a main signal, and it was widely used and exploited also by the Russian propaganda and the Kremlin's media, that there is disunity about especially Sweden's accession to NATO. Whether that argument was used to spread also division among Western allies, I'm not so certain, but the main area where this argument could be very well used, that's Russian domestic propaganda. So it was important for the Kremlin, for domestic political reason, that this happened. And while in the case of Turkey, I think we can be more or less certain that the power calculations was based really on the regime interest. In the case of Hungary, it's obvious that it was partially a strategic service to Russia. The country has a multivectoral foreign policy. It tries to have close, cordial ties to strategic contenders of its own Western alliance system, Russia and China. And this was part of this power calculation, why Prime Minister Orbán delayed this ratification 21 months long.
In the end, his agreement was essentially purchased through a quid pro quo. What exactly do Mr. Orbán and also Mr. Erdogan get out of all of this?
I think the two cases are absolutely different. For Turkey, it was really a crucial defense deal, which allowed practically the upgrading of the existing F-16 fleet to the newest level, which was important because the country's access to the fifth generation F-35 fighters was rejected by both the US administration and the US Congress. In the case of Hungary, no similar defense deal took place. So practically what we saw, the purchasing of 4 old generation Gripen fighters and the extension of the service package with 2 years is a face-saving measure that Prime Minister Orbán can also claim in the public that there was something in exchange for the Hungarian ratification. In reality, simply the pressure was too high and the Hungarian position was not sustainable anymore.
But if I may, just one sentence. But it's also showing us that for those members, domestic politics were more important than making sure that the alliance is being strengthened in the process. And this is very telling. It already did damage to NATO, I would say.
And in many ways, that's the exact thing that you could say about the US as well. It's very much about domestic politics. Wolfgang, if I can come to you to talk about another dispute among NATO's leading members at the moment, that has also stirred up doubts about the solidity of the Western alliance. When French President Macron said that he could not rule out sending ground troops to Ukraine, basically Chancellor Scholz pushed back immediately and contradicted him in a very public rebuke. What do you think that means, and how damaging is it for NATO?
Let me say first that there was a red line for a long time agreed within NATO that NATO member states would not become parties to the conflict, directly intervene. That means it was a red line to propose sending ground troops to Ukraine to fight directly Russia, because that could lead to an expansion or escalation of the war, and Europe could find itself in a terrible war, because we speak about 4 nuclear powers that would be involved in such kind of thing. So that was astonishing that Macron made this proposal. And what is even more astonishing is that obviously behind closed doors, it was clear already in the preceding meeting that this proposal would not find any support by the majority of EU and NATO states. Nevertheless, Macron went to the microphone afterwards in the public and announced that he could not exclude this option. So this sent, and of course the response by the Chancellor sent a signal of disunity rather than of unity. So insofar, one could even say it didn't serve the purpose. Of course, I understand that France wanted to increase its own role. It was in a defensive position, particularly after the Munich Security Conference. Some people even criticized France not to deliver as much as Germany did and lagged behind, etc. But as presidents of France see themselves, they have to have a leading role and take back the initiative. And I think that was also one of the reasons why Macron did it, but he did it not very skillfully. So now, finally, this group sent the signal of disunity. And regrettably, the other decision that was made, that is using the defense facility means also to buy, for example, ammunition abroad and not just in Europe or in France, that was then not recognized in the public so much. So there was also a signal of unity, but obviously it was not skillfully done.
Daniel, Wolfgang talked about seizing the initiative. Chancellor Scholz has often been accused of doing the opposite, of lagging behind in terms of leadership and of essentially always staying to the back, even though the German public now seems to support a more proactive position vis-a-vis Russia and in regard to support for Ukraine. Do we see here a fundamental weakening of the French-German motor within the alliance due also to German inertia?
I think we see weakening in the German-French tandem now for more than 2 years. And obviously this can be traced back to the lack of joint vision and obviously in some way the lack of chemistry between the leadership of the two countries. It's the tragedy, actually, of the German strategic thinking and Ukraine policy that the country is performing so high, practically as the second most important weapon delivery partner of Ukraine. Meanwhile, it cannot exploit this situation and turn it into an enhanced leadership position at European level. Obviously, that's also a sign of the weakening German strategic position within the European Union. But I think this didn't start with this announcement of President Macron. We see these cleavages in this European engine now for a time.
Alexandra, meanwhile, let's talk about Putin's reaction to all of this. His chief ideologue had described Russia's goal in general as the Finlandization of Europe. Instead, we get what you might call the Euro-Atlanticization of Scandinavia. Do you think Putin will have reckoned with those consequences? And how would you expect him to respond going forward?
Well, I think that, of course, the Kremlin and Putin himself, they saw what was coming. And after Finland's accession, we also saw kind of them trying to... There were reports about hybrid attacks. They were threatening to increase the number of troops on the border to Finland. But basically, I mean, this is NATO. I don't think that Putin would risk anything knowing what kind of response any attempt would be met with. So I don't expect any straightforward reaction. But of course, for sure, we will see maybe, hybrid attacks, a lot of propaganda probably trying to play down the fact that Sweden now also is joining NATO. And what I learned from my time covering Putin is that you should never expect something that it's like clear and you would do it, because they always would come up with something that is different and maybe also surprising.
Speaking of something different, let's stay with the topic of the Russian response and direct our attention to southeastern Europe, where a breakaway republic's request for Moscow's protection looked like a playbook for another special Russian military operation.
There has been an obvious increase in Russian soldiers at the borders and in Transnistria. It's unclear how many there are. They are the symbol of who is in charge in Transnistria, Putin's Russia. The Dniester River separates the Republic of Moldova from the breakaway region on the eastern bank, pro-Russian Transnistria, with its 360,000 inhabitants. The region broke away from the Republic of Moldova at the beginning of the 1990s. Geostrategically, the country is located at a focal point between the Republic of Moldova, which is pro-European, and Ukraine. Now the pro-Russian rulers are officially asking Russia for protection from Moldova. An initial reaction from Moscow shows the protection of the citizens of Transnistria is a priority. Will Transnistria become the next domino in Putin's expansion plans?
And let me put that question straight away to you, Wolfgang. Both as a military officer and as a security advisor, you have considerable experience also in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus, including in Georgia, where a similar frozen conflict has been going on for quite a long time. Do you think Transnistria is the next domino?
I think we have seen tensions in Transnistria coming up and then again flowing down several times. This is a 30 years old conflict, I would say a post-Soviet conflict, where it was not clear from the beginning whether Moldova would join back to Romania, as it was historically the case between the First and Second World War, and then these Slavic populations would not be in a position to do that and wanted to maybe then regain their own independence or join Russia. This is something we have discussed for years. The OSCE, the Organization for Security and Security Cooperation in Europe, was involved. The Russians that were had a mandate for peacekeeping operations were also asked to withdraw heavy weaponry, which they did, also with German verification contribution in the years up to 2003. Since then, we have around 1,500 Russian and local troops in this area with light equipment. So when you look realistically also at the geography of that conflict, I could not imagine that major operations could start from there. In particular, since the Russian forces are totally absorbed, in particular land forces with the Ukrainian war, and even their withdrew forces from Kaliningrad, from the Baltic borders, and from, by the way, also from the very long border to Finland. So the question is, how should Russia react?
Yeah, in a nutshell, could this lead to annexation?
In a nutshell, Russia has no means at the moment to do that. They would, of course, be happy when the tensions could be increased at this point. But a real military threat I cannot see for the moment, but the tensions will rise.
Thank you very much. Let me pass that straight on to Daniel. Moldova itself seemed to downplay the Transnistrian request, saying it was a propaganda move. What should the West do now? How should the West respond?
I think the West response should be mostly led by the expectations of Moldova here, because ultimately it's about the sovereignty and territorial integrity of that country. But however, if we take a look, what could be the real strategic intentions of the Kremlin with this move? This is obviously hindering Moldova's European accession process and also to influence the presidential elections, which will be upcoming during the spring. And in this regard, I think the European responses should also aim at those two fields, being committed to the accession outlooks and the accession process of Moldova, and also try to ensure that the presidential elections in the spring and their integrity will remain intact and as democratic as it's possible under these circumstances.
Alexandra, what's the response in Brussels to all of this? Surely the timing of this move is not entirely coincidental.
No, it's not. And we just mentioned the election in Russia, and that is for sure a motivation for Putin to have this opportunity to present himself as a strong leader and to signal to his own people, listen, it's not only the Russian speakers in Ukraine that we are ready and we are protecting already in their own, that's their narrative. But he can now point to Transnistria and say, we are ready and determined to help them too. And that, of course, is helping him probably in the election campaign to present himself as a strong leader. And I think that for Brussels, it will be important to first understand that this is Russia's attempt to hamper Moldova's accession to EU, European Union, but it also should be a motivation for Brussels to speed up the process, not to wait for the European election that is also taking place this summer, but to try to speed up the process and to offer Moldova, as well as Ukraine, a real perspective in the European Union in the future.
Wolfgang, very briefly, if you would, the Baltic republics, in particular Latvia and Estonia, also have very significant shares of Russian origin populations. Could this Donbass Transnistria playbook one day be applied also to these NATO member states?
Two answers. First, it will depend on the question how this war in Ukraine would turn out to be. Finally, it would also depend on the question how the Estonia, particularly and Latvia, would comply with the minority rights according to EU standards. Here, I don't see any major interest of also of the Russian-speaking population to join Russia for the moment. I think the tensions cannot be compared with Ukraine. Then we come back to the question of forces, which I don't see. After the war in Ukraine, which absorbed a lot of Russian forces, it will probably take a long time until Russia could have again stationed significant forces at the Finnish and the Baltic border. And we will see whether up to then Europe is in a position to have some stability agreement with Russia.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang Richter. Thank you also to Alexandra and Daniel for being with us, and to all of our viewers. Thank you for joining.